Wanna know what kept medieval Europeans up at night? No, not taxes or romance, but the terrifying fear that sneezing meant the devil just entered their nostrils, or that butter might literally kill them. Welcome to a time when your neighbor could burn your cat because it blinked weirdly during a thunderstorm. Superstition wasn't just folklore, it was the awkward user manual for surviving a world that made absolutely no sense. And, spoiler, a lot of people didn't survive. Tonight, we're tucking you in with the most ridiculous, uncomfortable, and eerily relatable beliefs from Europe's long, anxious past. If you're already clutching your pillow in disbelief, hit that subscribe button, because history is never boring when it's irrational, awkward, and narrated by someone who's judging it slightly. Once upon a time, specifically in medieval Europe, sneezing was less of a bodily function and more of a spiritual crisis. You see, to sneeze in the 1300s wasn't just your nose doing a violent reboot. It was the ominous ding-dong of a supernatural doorbell, and the one answering, Satan, obviously. Yes, for our long-dead ancestors, a sneeze was a sign not of pollen or bad hygiene, but of a demon trying to hijack your soul via your nasal cavity. Let that sink in. Imagine a world where hay fever was basically a form of spiritual Russian roulette. This is why God Bless You exists. It wasn't originally a sweet, polite, socially acceptable cough of empathy. It was a magical incantation designed to prevent your head from flying off and landing in Beelzebub's inbox. A one-word exorcism tossed casually like a religious reflex. In fact, during plague outbreaks, the Pope ordered that everyone immediately bless a sneezer. No time to think, just react. Bless now, explain later. Of course, you might be wondering why sneezing. Why not, say, hiccups or burps? Well, that's because sneezing was considered a moment of vulnerability, a brief, unguarded crack in the human shell. And in a world with no concept of bacteria, but lots of fear about spiritual possession, that crack was just big enough for a demon to slip through and throw a rave in your ribcage. And then there was the plague. Ah, yes, the original this dash is dash not dash a dash drill moment in European medical history, when the Black Death began sweeping through Europe like a goth influencer's perfume cloud. Sneezing gained a brand new reputation, the opening act of your final days. People genuinely believed that if you sneezed, it meant death was already checking your vitals. Some even thought the soul literally exited the body during a sneeze. So, God Bless You wasn't just a spiritual umbrella. It was a panicked, last-ditch, save this soul before it gets yoinked into the abyss. And what did people do to protect themselves from all this invisible evil? Masks, but not the surgical kind. Oh no, they wore ... beaks. Specifically, plague doctors, the original horror movie extras, donned bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and spices, cinnamon, cloves, lavender. They thought the sweet smells would filter out the deadly bad air, or miasma, which they assumed carried the disease. Germ theory, that wouldn't be invented for another few hundred years. In the meantime, everyone just rolled with the idea that if it smelled bad, it was probably killing you. Let's zoom in for a moment. Picture a street in 14th century Paris, the stench of unwashed humanity, horses doing their business, people doing their business in alleyways. A child sneezes violently. A peasant woman drops her basket of onions, crosses herself frantically, and whispers a prayer. A man rings a handbell as he walks past, warning that someone in his household has fallen ill. And the child, probably just inhaled too much chimney soot, but no one's taking chances. Not in this town. Here's the charming irony. Some people believed sneezing was healthy, a sign the body was purging illness. The contradiction, others thought it caused illness. Which one was it? No one knew. But if someone sneezed twice and then keeled over, that was all the confirmation they needed. Case closed. Cause of death: dramatic sneezing. And naturally, people started trying to prevent sneezing at all costs. Herbal amulets were common. Garlic, juniper berries, dried sage tucked into little leather pouches and hung around the neck like scented shields. Sneezing in church: risky. Sneezing during childbirth: absolutely not. That could curse the baby. Sneezing while making bread: congratulations, you've just hexed your entire village. Let's take a brief pause. Imagine living in a world so full of anxiety that your own face betraying you mid-conversation could mean public ostracism, spiritual doom, or a panicked priest dousing you with holy water. So yeah, breathe that in, dust and all. But it gets better. In some regions, there were rules about how you could sneeze. Sneeze too quietly: suspicious. What are you hiding? Sneeze too loudly: clearly trying to expel a demon. Sneeze 3 times in a row: go straight to the monastery. Do not pass go. And then came the bells. Yes, bells. During plague outbreaks, it became customary for people to ring handbells outside infected homes. The idea was to warn others: don't come in, this house is cursed with disease and possibly possessed by the devil. Often, this was done by monks or designated town criers, who were essentially medieval public health sirens. Imagine you're sneezing, feverish, and barely conscious, and the last sound you hear before you slip into oblivion is a slow, mournful clang outside your door. Sleep tight, of course. All of this was done with the best intentions. They genuinely thought they were saving lives or souls. Which raises the uncomfortable question: how much of our modern behavior is just better dressed superstition? Even now, we say bless you automatically. We hand someone a tissue and perform a little social ritual, smiling awkwardly like we've fulfilled our obligation. No one knows why we do it. We just do. Because somewhere, buried under layers of civilization, is the same quiet terror that something invisible might be listening, watching, waiting, so the next time someone lets out a mighty achoo, maybe give them more than a bless you. Give them a nod of respect. They've just reenacted one of humanity's oldest panic reflexes. And congratulations, if you've made it this far without sneezing, you're either immune or cursed. Imagine a world where your cat, Fluffy, aloof, judgmental, could get you killed. And not metaphorically, like when they knock over your coffee during a Zoom call. No, we're talking actually executed, in public, with torches. Because in medieval Europe, a purring feline wasn't just a pet, it was a walking red flag for witchcraft. Let's rewind to the 13th century. Pope Gregory IX, a man with a suspiciously judgmental name and even more judgmental views, decided that cats, especially black ones, were obviously evil. Why? Because a German heretic group known as the Cathars, already off to a bad PR start, allegedly worshipped a giant black cat during their satanic rituals. And like every good moral panic, it didn't need proof, just vibes. Gregory issued a papal bull in 1233. No, not an actual bull, a decree. But yes, it did amount to let's ruin cats forever. The document associated black cats with Satan himself, kickstarting centuries of feline-targeted violence. Cats were rounded up, tortured, and burned alive in the name of spiritual hygiene. That's right, medieval Europe essentially launched a crusade against whiskers. Let that settle in for a second. People believed cats were demonic because they blinked slowly, or purred in the moonlight, or just existed in a way that humans couldn't fully understand. Sound familiar? But here's the punchline. By killing off cats en masse, Europeans basically handed rats a VIP pass to thrive. And rats, as you may recall, were the primary Uber drivers of the bubonic plague. So, by purging the evil animals, they accidentally turbocharged the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. You know, just your classic historical irony. Still, the paranoia didn't stop with PayPal documents and overconfident priests. Everyday villagers got in on the action. In some towns, it was considered suspicious if a cat followed you around, especially if it sat near your doorstep. That could mean your house was marked by a witch, or worse, that you were a witch, using the cat as a familiar, a demonic spirit disguised in fur. One poor woman in England, her name lost to time because misogyny, was accused of witchcraft because her black cat meowed during a thunderstorm. The logic, clearly, the cat was talking to the devil. Not scared of the thunder. Not hungry. Not, you know, a cat. Nope. Satanic Morse code. And yes, cats were tried, like in court. Sometimes, entire animal trials were held. Europe really looked at a cat licking its paw and thought, you're going on the stand. In France, a town once dragged a black cat to a mock trial, found it guilty of being a witch's accomplice, and hanged it in public. Audience and everything. Somewhere, the rats cheered. Let's talk color theory for a moment. Black cats got the worst of it because the color black was associated with death, mystery, and the unknown. But it wasn't just about looks, it was about independence. Cats weren't like dogs. They didn't fetch, didn't grovel, didn't bark to protect you from invaders. They walked around like they owned the place. And in a society obsessed with control and obedience, that made people nervous. Here's a brief mental exercise. Imagine you're a 14th century peasant. You live in a cottage with walls made of mud and regret. You've lost 3 children to bad air. Your crops are failing. And your neighbor's cow just gave birth to a calf with one eye. Who do you blame? Not the cow, not the weather, certainly. Not the church. You blame Agnes, the slightly weird woman down the lane who talks to her cat like it's her roommate. Clearly, she hexed the milk. Probably cursed your child too. And suddenly, that innocent feline stretching on the windowsill becomes Exhibit A in a witch trial fueled by fear, superstition, and maybe a dash of envy. Weirdly, the belief in magical cats wasn't always negative. In some corners of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, cats were revered. The Norse even had a goddess named Freya, who rode a chariot pulled by 2 giant cats. But these myths were no match for PayPal PR campaigns and a good old-fashioned mass hysteria bonfire. And here's the kicker. Even after the Enlightenment, you know, the era where humans pretended to be rational, cat superstitions still lingered. Black cats remained omens of bad luck well into the 19th and even 20th centuries. People would cross the street to avoid one. Ships sometimes refused to board them. And on Halloween, forget it. They became marketing props for our inherited fear dressed up as fun. Reflect on this. Entire populations spent hundreds of years blaming a purring, loaf-shaped creature for everything from crop failure to demonic possession, all because it didn't obey. because it seemed mysterious, because it didn't need us so. Yes, your medieval ancestor may have watched a cat knock over a candle and genuinely believed the Antichrist was in the room, and then gathered the town, and now we buy them tuna-filled snacks, let them sleep on our laptops, and accept their judgment as the price of their affection. Which begs the question, have we really changed, or are we just slightly more polite to the things we fear? Welcome to medieval interior decorating, where the hottest design trend wasn't velvet tapestries or forged iron sconces. No, it was something far more practical, like stuffing your dead child's shoe into a wall cavity to ward off witches. HGTV, eat your heart out. You see, back then, homes weren't just places to sleep, eat, and watch rats do unspeakable things. In the pantry, they were battlegrounds, constantly under threat from evil spirits, vengeful ghosts, or that cursed midwife with a lazy eye. And since most people couldn't afford a priest on retainer, they took supernatural defense into their own cracked, calloused hands. Enter the concealed shoe. This was no random accident. All across Europe, particularly in England and parts of Germany, people were deliberately hiding old, worn-out shoes inside the structure of their homes, behind walls, under floorboards, inside chimneys, not to preserve memories or confuse future archaeologists, but to stop witches from crawling through the plaster and stealing their souls. Yes, that's a sentence someone once believed, completely unironically. But why shoes? Well, shoes carried a kind of psychic residue, or so the theory went. After all, they molded to your feet, carried your sweat, your scent, your essence. And in a world where hair clippings and fingernails were considered magical items, your rank old boot was basically a holy relic. A smelly, cracked leather talisman that told spirits, someone already lives here, move along. Some scholars call these apotropic items, objects meant to avert evil. Others just call them unsettling, especially when you're renovating your cottage and suddenly yank a single moldy clog from inside a support beam. Imagine the home inspection report, and shoes weren't the only DIY defense strategy. Let's talk teeth. Human teeth. Specifically, children's, in certain parts of Europe. It became common practice to bury a child's lost tooth in the fireplace. Or, if that felt too obvious, into the chimney itself. Why? Because fireplaces were seen as portals, spiritual backdoors, if you will. And just like today's toddlers slipping Legos into heating vents, people were cramming in protective items to block anything evil from slipping through. Picture it, a chilly medieval evening. Smoke curling from the hearth, and deep within the sooty bricks, nestled between cobwebs and regret, a tiny incisor, quietly guarding your family from spectral intrusion. Now let's pause here and reflect. What would make an entire culture feel so unsafe, so vulnerable, that the solution was to fill their homes with hidden body parts and crusty footwear? These weren't wild conspiracy theorists. They were average, hard-working, anxiety-ridden people, doing their best to make sense of a world where children died from fevers, crops failed without warning, and your neighbor could accuse you of witchcraft for sneezing weird. They weren't stupid, they were scared, and fear is excellent at creating rituals. Sometimes the logic was oddly specific. In one recorded case from Northamptonshire, England, a family built a new addition to their home and promptly buried a pair of boots under the fresh floorboards to stop the devil from entering through the new part. Apparently Satan was deeply respectful of zoning laws. Other homeowners upped the ante, not just one shoe, but a collection. Several dwellings have been found containing caches of mismatched footwear, all deliberately concealed. Archaeologists initially thought they were old storage spaces, but nope, they were supernatural landmines. The idea was simple: confuse the witch. She'd get distracted trying to figure out whose stinky boot she'd just smelled and forget to hex the baby. There's even evidence that builders were paid extra to embed these charms during construction, because nothing says move-in ready like a rotting slipper nailed under the window frame. Of course, not all protective items were biological. Some families used dried cats, mummified and strategically placed in the walls, which, frankly, feels like a terrible way to protect yourself from witchcraft. Especially when we recall Chapter 2, where cats were the alleged source of the problem. But hey, consistency was not medieval Europe's strong suit. Let's not forget about iron nails bent into crosses, garlands made from human hair, and yes, even dead birds entombed inside brickwork. Each object whispered the same thing: we don't understand what's hurting us, but maybe this will help. And maybe the most poignant part: many of these hidden charms weren't discovered until centuries later. Quietly entombed, never touched, silently working, or believed to be. One shoe found in Norfolk had been there since the 1600s, still nestled behind the brick. Its leather warped but intact. Someone had placed it there, believing truly that it would keep their family safe. Modern renovations occasionally become unexpected history lessons. Contractors and homeowners stumble upon these grimy time capsules and ask, why is there a child's tooth inside the fireplace? And the answer is, because someone, long before you, loved their family enough to bury molars in mortar. So next time you lose something in the wall's keys, phone, charger, dignity, take a breath. Maybe it's not lost. Maybe it's just part of the protection plan. After all, you never know what's coming down the chimney. And really, what would you hide if you were truly afraid? In modern times, being left-handed is just mildly inconvenient. A smudge on your notebook page, a weird pair of scissors, maybe the occasional awkward high five. But in medieval Europe, it meant you were probably possessed, or a witch, or both. Let's get something straight. The word sinister comes from the Latin sinistra, which literally means left. That's not a coincidence. That's branding. For centuries, the left side, and anything associated with it, was seen as suspicious, unnatural, and spiritually dirty. And that includes left-handed people, who were lumped in with thieves, heretics, and that one guy in the village who made eye contact for too long. The right hand, by contrast, was holy, righteous, God's chosen limb. Jesus is said to sit at the right hand of the Father, never the left. Because apparently, even in heaven, seating arrangements matter. In religious art, saints blessed with their right hands. Oaths were taken with the right hand. The left hand, reserved for unclean tasks, and probably opening portals to hell. So imagine being a child in the 14th century. You pick up a spoon with your left hand, and suddenly the village priest is sweating. Your schoolmaster starts twitching. Your mother looks at you like you just declared loyalty to Lucifer. That's how real the fear was. Being left-handed wasn't quirky. It was a moral emergency. And the response, correction. Violent, persistent correction. Left-handed children were beaten, literally, until they learned to use their proper hand. They were forced to write, eat, and even gesture with their right, regardless of comfort or ability. Why? Because left was wrong. Left was evil. Left was them. Pause a moment and think about how unsettling that is. How early bias becomes brutality, cloaked in righteousness. How easily fear of difference curdles into cruelty. Now let's pivot to something deeply European: sword fighting. In medieval fencing manuals, left-handed fighters were considered unpredictable and dangerous. Not because of skill, mind you, but because their very stance was different, reversed. Most right-handed swordsmen trained to fight other righties. When a southpaw entered the arena, it messed with everyone's muscle memory. Unfair advantage, maybe. Sign of sorcery. Definitely, because clearly, adapting your body to a reversed stance was the work of dark forces and not, say, practice. There's a famous case from 1453, where a knight, Guillaume de Malvoisin, was accused of cheating in a duel because he fought with his left. He didn't poison anyone. He didn't even break the rules. He just swung from the wrong side. And the court took it seriously. Left-handedness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a disruption. A crack in the social order. A reminder that the world didn't always follow your script. Even the legal system got in on the act. In parts of Europe, testimony from left-handed people was considered less trustworthy. Oh, you saw the accused commit murder, but with your left eye, sit down, Satan. The prejudice was woven into institutions, often without logic, but with plenty of certainty. Marriage ceremonies had their quirks too. During traditional vows, couples would join right hands, the good hands. Joining lefts was considered unlucky, taboo, even dangerous. In some regions, you didn't dare scratch your left palm. That was said to invite poverty. Scratch. You're right, you'd come into money. Because obviously, financial luck is just a matter of which hand itches more poetically. Let's not ignore the emotional toll here. Imagine being told, from the time you could hold a spoon, that something was wrong with you. Not because you lied or stole or kicked the local goose. Just because your dominant hand didn't match the diagram. And it wasn't just Europe. Cultures across the globe carried similar beliefs, from Japan to the Middle East. But, in medieval Europe, the superstition was particularly loaded, tangled up in religious fervor, patriarchal order, and a deep obsession with purity. There's a melancholic little tale from 1497 about a monk in Burgundy who kept injuring his right hand while copying manuscripts. After the third injury, he quietly switched to his left and produced beautiful work. But when his brothers found out, they accused him of arrogance. You presume to write holy texts with the hand of Satan. They shamed him into stopping. His surviving scrolls were unsigned, his name lost to time, all because he dared to be ambidextrous. Let that sink in now, before we get to smug. This superstition didn't magically vanish with the Renaissance. Left-handed children were still punished in schools well into the 20th century. Some of your grandparents might remember rulers across knuckles, ink-stained palms, and teachers insisting you'll grow out of it. All for the crime of having a dominant hemisphere. Today we celebrate lefties, or at least tolerate them with novelty mugs and sarcastic t-shirts. But beneath the jokes is a long shadow of forced conformity. A reminder that once, the very way your body moved could make you suspect. So next time you see someone sign their name with a lefty flair, pause. That's not just handwriting, that's rebellion, that's resilience. That's centuries of awkward superstition flipping society, the bird. With the correct hand in the medieval world, food wasn't just food, it was a fragile ceasefire between life and whatever spiritual horror was lurking in the rafters. Bread could bless you, beer could curse you, and if either one misbehaved, people didn't blame bad yeast. They blamed demons. Because clearly, the flour was haunted. Let's start with bread. It wasn't just a staple, it was sacred. In a society where most people lived one failed harvest away from famine, bread wasn't dinner, it was survival. And survival, as usual, came with a generous side of superstition. Bakers were a strange breed, part artisan, part priest, part suspect. They handled the holy food. After all, bread was tied directly to the body of Christ in Christian belief, which meant a poorly baked loaf could be seen as a sign of sin, spiritual decay, or witchcraft. And if your dough refused to rise, well, time to check if your neighbor recently glared at your oven. In one Bavarian village in 1389, a woman was dragged into court because her bread came out bitter and grey. Her neighbors insisted she'd cursed the grain. She insisted she'd just run out of salt. Guess who the judge believed? Spoiler, not the woman. People believed bread had moods. If it cracked open during baking, it meant a death was coming. If the crust blistered, someone in the village had lied. And if it fell flat, clearly a hex. It couldn't possibly be that. The oven was 700 years old and powered by wishful thinking. Some households would mark loaves with a cross before baking, not for decoration, but protection. The idea was that, without a holy symbol, the devil might enter the bread and use it to curse whoever ate it. So yes, bread possession was a legitimate concern. Imagine biting into your morning toast and wondering if it's possessed. Let that swirl around your modern, gluten-tolerant brain. Now, beer. Glorious, bubbling, deeply suspicious beer. In medieval Europe, beer was more than just a drink. It was liquid life insurance. Water was risky. Alcohol was safer. So everyone, from toddlers to monks, drank beer daily. But just because it was common didn't mean it was trusted. If a batch of beer failed to ferment, turned sour, or just tasted funny, which, let's be honest, happened often, the fault wasn't put on hygiene or science. It was blamed on witches or beer demons, or both, because why stop at one scapegoat when you can have two? In certain regions, people believed in beer witches. Women, because of course, who cursed the brew with a glance. One tavern owner in Prague was so paranoid that he kept his beer barrels in a locked room surrounded by iron horseshoes. Why? Because iron repels magic, obviously. Unless the demon was really determined, in which case, well, good luck. And then there's the tale of Greta, the brew wife, a real person turned cautionary legend in early 1400s Cologne. Greta was famous for her delicious ale. One day, her brew went bad. Locals claimed they saw her talking to a black bird that morning. By sundown, she was chained in a cellar. By morning, she was burned. The moral: don't talk to wildlife before brewing. Beer rituals got stranger. In some towns, people would speak blessings over the barrels. Others stirred the mash with holy relics, sometimes literal saint bones, to ensure purity. And if the bubbles looked wrong, time for an exorcism. Not of the person, of the keg. It's worth noting that brewing was traditionally women's work. Alewives ran most of the beer production in Europe for centuries. They wore tall hats for visibility in markets, carried big cauldrons, and kept cats to chase away rats. Sound familiar? Yes, that's the visual that helped inspire our modern image of the witch. All because they knew how to ferment a barley mash. Let's slow it down for a second. Can you imagine living in a world where every failed recipe might cost you your reputation or your life, where baking the wrong way on the wrong day could trigger panic. That's what food prep looked like for much of history. One part nourishment, one part potential felony. And it wasn't just the making of food. Eating had rules too. You couldn't cut bread upside down, that was bad luck. Dropping a crust meant a soul in purgatory was watching. Sharing beer with a stranger without toasting first. Inviting a demon to dinner. You might think these were just silly village ideas, but even royalty weren't immune. In 1572, Queen Elizabeth I reportedly refused to eat a loaf of bread that smelled wrong and demanded the entire kitchen staff be investigated. Turns out someone had used spoiled yeast, but imagine the anxiety that caused. Someone probably lost a head over that sourdouch. So next time you burn a batch of cookies, be thankful you don't live in a century where that might trigger a witch trial. And next time you crack open a warm beer, toast to Greta the brewwife, and all the other culinary victims of supernatural paranoia, because history isn't just told in battles and kings. Sometimes it's baked into bread crusts and floating in frothy mugs, with a little fear, a lot of ignorance, and just the faintest hint of cinnamon. Before mirrors became tools for selfies, outfit checks, or late-night existential dread, they were seen as dangerous. Not in the 7 years bad luck kind of way, more like gateway to the demonic underworld, dangerous in medieval Europe. Mirrors weren't household accessories, they were spiritual landmines, perched delicately, between vanity and full-blown supernatural panic. Let's start with the obvious. Most people didn't even own mirrors. Not because they weren't vain, they were, but because mirrors were rare, expensive, and slightly terrifying. Glass was precious. Polishing it until it reflected anything besides your own distorted shame. Even more so. But when someone did get their hands on a mirror, the superstitions came free of charge. For starters, it was widely believed that mirrors could trap souls. If a person died in a room with uncovered mirrors, their soul might get confused. Yes, confused, and wander into the glass, forever stuck in a reflective purgatory. So, during deathbeds and funerals, mirrors were carefully covered with black cloth. You know, just in case Uncle Thomas's spirit tried to take a wrong turn and end up haunting your bathroom. Sync. This wasn't just local folklore. It was pan-European policy, from the Bavarian Alps to the cobbled alleys of Florence. Grieving families flung blankets over mirrors, like panicked stagehands, all to keep the dearly departed from becoming roommates with their own reflections. Let that sink in. Your family might be mourning you and worried about ghost-proofing the furniture, multitasking at its most morbid. But it wasn't just the dead who had to worry. Mirrors could also invite spirits in. Some people believed that staring into a mirror for too long, especially at night or by candlelight, could open a portal, a literal, shimmering door, through which something else might come through. A demon, a ghost, maybe just your own twisted reflection, staring back a little too knowingly. One charming 14th century superstition warned that girls who looked into mirrors by moonlight would see the devil appear behind them. Not their future husband, not a spooky jump scare, but Lucifer himself, practicing his photobombing skills. And yet somehow they still did it. Because of course they did. This leads us to the infamous practice of mirror scrying. While not exclusive to Europe, it became a quiet obsession during the later medieval and Renaissance periods. People believed that with the right ritual, candles, prayers, maybe a pinch of grave dirt, a mirror could reveal hidden truths, the future, a lost love, the name of the person who hexed your goat. But tread carefully, because if you looked too long, the mirror might start looking back. And then there were windows now. Today, windows are where we put houseplants and pretend we're in a coming-of-age movie while it rains. But in medieval Europe, windows were spiritual liabilities, literal holes in your wall that could let in more than just drafts. Windows were considered liminal spaces, thresholds between the physical world and the unseen one. Spirits, curses, even witches, riding the wind could allegedly pass through. This is why some people nailed iron nails into their windowsills, not for reinforcement, for supernatural pest control. Iron, as we'll see again and again, was considered repellent to magic, as if a witch would peer in, spot the hardware, and say, "Ah, drat, foiled by metallurgy again." There were also rules. You couldn't open a window during childbirth. Spirits might snatch the baby's soul. During thunderstorms, windows had to be shuttered and covered, not for fear of lightning strikes, but because lightning was considered divine fury, and you didn't want God seeing what you were up to indoors. Modesty by meteorology. Some towns had regulations about which direction windows could face. North-facing ones, risky, west-facing, sometimes associated with death. The south was safest. Full sunlight, fewer demons. That's architectural exorcism at its finest. Let's return to mirrors for one haunting example. In a quiet village in Bohemia, around 1451, a blacksmith named Elias reported that his wife refused to have a mirror in their home. She claimed her grandmother had once seen a second reflection in her looking glass, an image that moved a split second out of sync. Everyone thought she was mad, until, one day, Elias brought home a polished mirror from a market. That night, their child awoke screaming, saying there's a lady in the wall. The mirror was shattered by morning, and no one in the village ever brought one home again. Now, was that real? Maybe. Was it believed? Absolutely. That's the power of superstition. It doesn't need to be true, just feared. Even modern folklore hasn't escaped the pull. Bloody Mary, anyone. Say her name 3 times into a mirror and she appears. That little game you played at slumber parties. Yeah, its roots are planted deep in centuries-old terror that mirrors are more than just glass and silver. They're invitations, and yet, here we are today, staring into them every morning, checking our teeth, fixing our hair, trusting they only reflect and don't remember. But deep down, maybe a sliver of that old fear remains. The way your reflection sometimes doesn't look quite right, the flicker at the edge of the glass, the feeling that something might be watching from the other side. So next time you walk past a mirror in the dark, don't look too long, because what if it's not you that's looking back? The moon, celestial nightlight, romantic backdrop, silent rock hurtling through space. Today, we write poems about it, take moody selfies under it, blame it for mild insomnia or weird energy in yoga class. But in medieval Europe, the moon was suspicious, treacherous, a silvery eye in the sky that watched you, judged you, and maybe even turned you into a wolf. Welcome to lunacy. And yes, that word literally comes from luna, Latin for moon, because for centuries, Europeans believed that the full moon could mess with your mind, scramble your humors, and, if the vibe was just right, send you frothing into the woods, howling at nothing in particular. Let's start with the medical science. Medieval physicians believed the moon governed more than tides. It controlled bodily fluids, the famous for humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These weren't just gross fluids, they were personality settings. The moon, with its waxing and waning, could jostle them into chaos. A full moon, that was a hard reset. Mental illness, seizures, even epilepsy, all blamed on the lunar cycle. Having a bad day. Clearly, the moon was at fault. This belief wasn't fringe. Entire hospitals scheduled treatments based on moon phases. Surgeons refused to operate during certain lunar alignments. One English physician in 1353 claimed a man's nosebleeds were directly linked to the moon's boiling influence upon his brain. Medical degree not required. Just look up and panic. But moon-based madness was just the appetizer. The main course. Werewolves. Yes, lycanthropy. The charming belief that human beings could transform into wolves under the light of the full moon. We're not talking Twilight here. No shirtless heartthrobs, just hairy, snarling terror. The earliest written accounts go back to classical antiquity, but medieval Europe gave werewolves their globe as demonic agents, cursed souls, or just very cranky peasants. In many parts of France and Germany, a man accused of being a werewolf was tried, like any other criminal, interrogated, tortured, and occasionally burned. Why? Because the moon, they believed, could trigger the transformation. Full moon equals full monster. One particularly sad case occurred in 1589. A German man named Peter Stump, sometimes spelled Stubb, was accused of being a werewolf. His alleged crimes, horrific his trial. Even more so, under torture, he confessed to making a pact with the devil and wearing a magical belt that turned him into a wolf. No one ever found the belt. They still executed him anyway, along with his daughter and mistress. Just to be thorough, why the obsession with wolves? Simple, wolves were feared, apex predators of the European countryside. They ate livestock. They threatened children. They were the stuff of campfire nightmares. So, blending them with human sin created the perfect cocktail of terror. Add the moon, and you had a built-in schedule for when society should collectively freak out. But the moon wasn't just blamed for turning people into beasts. It could also bleach your soul, yes. According to some medieval texts, exposing yourself to full moonlight could literally drain your spirit. It was said to pale the blood and hollow the mind. In one tale from Italy, a woman insisted her husband was moonstruck after he spent a night sleeping beneath a window without shutters. She claimed he woke up, different, quiet, cold-eyed, a husk of himself. Naturally, the priest was called. There were even superstitions about moonlight changing your appearance. Pale skin, the mark of one too often caught under its gaze. Silver hair, moon-blessed or moon-cursed. Beauty or bane, depending on who you asked. The connection between femininity and the moon, especially through the lens of menstruation and fertility, only deepened the folklore. Women were seen as lunar creatures, mystical, changeable, dangerous, a bit like the moon itself. Now here's where things get especially weird. Moonlight wasn't just scary, it was contagious. It was believed that moon-touched people could pass on their condition through eye contact, touch, or even shared dreams. Sleepwalking during a full moon, that wasn't sleepwalking. That was wandering of the soul, an act of partial possession. Pause for a moment. Take that in. Imagine fearing the light in your bedroom window. Not because of burglars or ghosts, but because the moonlight might sneak in and rearrange your sanity like a forgotten jigsaw puzzle. You pull the curtains shut, not for privacy, but to stop yourself from turning into a lunatic, or worse, something with fangs. And this wasn't just folklore for peasants. Aristocrats, monks, and doctors all bought in. Manuscripts from as late as the 1600s offered detailed charts aligning moon phases with violent tendencies. King Charles VI of France, who once believed he was made of glass, had episodes timed to lunar cycles. His handlers treated the moon like a co-conspirator. Even architecture got involved. Some households were designed with minimal moon exposure. No large windows facing east or west, and sleeping quarters set deep in the center of the home. All to avoid the moon's eye. Because when the moon stared, it saw too much. Of course, modern science has mostly debunked all of this. There's no proven link between moon cycles and mental illness, crime, or werewolfism. Tragic, I know. But belief lingers. Hospital workers today still swear full moons bring chaos. Police officers report higher call volumes. Teachers joke about wild classrooms. Coincidence maybe. Tradition, definitely. Because superstition doesn't die easily. Especially not the kind that glows in the sky every 28 days. Reminding us, gently, beautifully, ominously, that the world is always shifting, even when we're asleep. So next time you're up late and the moonlight hits your floor, just right, ask yourself, is it just light? Or is something watching? Let's talk about hair. Not in the bad hair day, or should I get bangs? Sense, no, let's get medieval with it. In ancient and medieval Europe, your hair was less of a style statement and more of a supernatural target. Every snip, comb, or lock lost was a minor existential crisis. If you're used to a world where a bad haircut means deleting your Instagram for a week, imagine a world where trimming your split ends could doom your soul. For starters, hair was believed to be a vessel for your life force. It grew from your body, sure, but unlike toenails, it was visible, tactile, and, most importantly, this is why, for centuries, people would burn their hair clippings after a cut. Why? Because everyone knew that if a witch got her hands on your discarded curls, she could curse you, or worse, control you. Yes, the original bad hair day was less about cowlicks and more about hexes. Medieval barbers, those delightful part-time surgeons with the hygiene habits of a particularly optimistic raccoon, had a pretty terrifying job. Imagine the barber's shop as a cross between a medical theater and a haunted curiosity cabinet. Need a trim? Sure. While you're here, how about some bloodletting, a quick tooth extraction, and a silent prayer that the barber doesn't pocket your hair for his own sorcerous side hustle? Let's make it even more absurd. There were strict rules about when you could cut your hair. Mondays, maybe safe. Fridays, absolutely not. It was believed that haircuts on certain days, especially during a full moon, a solar eclipse, or after attending a funeral, could result in bad luck, illness, or even death. There's a charming tale from a small French village. A man decided to trim his beard on Good Friday, and by Easter Sunday, he was bedridden with a mysterious fever. Coincidence? Of course not. Supernatural retribution, naturally dot and combs. Oh, the humble comb. Far from a mere detangler, the comb was viewed with deep suspicion. It was a magical tool, capable of blessing or cursing, depending on the user's intentions. For this reason, sharing your comb was strictly forbidden. To use someone else's comb, especially without permission, was to risk entangling your fate with theirs. You weren't just borrowing a grooming tool, you were playing dice with destiny. During thunderstorms, People hid their combs away, believing that lightning might charge the comb with destructive energy. Brushing your hair during a storm, that was basically ringing the dinner bell for disaster. Your house could catch fire, your crops could fail, your livestock might suddenly die of fright. All because you wanted smooth locks when the thunder rolled in. And let's not skip the social symbolism. In many cultures, hair was linked to power, purity, and status. Cutting a child's hair for the first time was a huge deal, a rite of passage requiring specific prayers, coins under the pillow, or the sacrifice of a perfectly good chicken. If a widow cut her hair too soon after her husband's death, neighbors would gossip that she was inviting spirits into the house. It didn't matter whether she wanted a fresh start. What mattered was maintaining cosmic balance, at least according to Aunt Marjorie. There's an infamous case from the 16th century. A queen, paranoid about being cursed, forbade her servants from collecting her fallen hairs. Every strand was carefully swept up and burned in the fireplace. Yet, one fateful afternoon, a jealous lady-in-waiting stole a comb with a few stray hairs and smuggled it out. Within a week, the queen developed an embarrassing rash. The palace promptly blamed witchcraft. The lady-in-waiting was banished, and the royal barbers switched to cleaning up with tongs and gloves. Pause for a breath or a head scratch, if you dare. Reflect on this. In a world of plagues, wars, and famines, it was often the little things, a lock of hair, a wooden comb, that inspired the most anxiety. Maybe because they felt controllable. Maybe because in the chaos of medieval life, keeping track of your own hair seemed like the only rational choice. And yet, these superstitions lasted. Even today, many cultures still warn against sharing combs, cutting hair at night, or leaving clippings where birds might find them, lest the birds weave them into a nest and doom you to headaches forever. So the next time you sweep the salon floor or toss a stray hair in the trash, consider how much quieter life is without having to suspect every bristle of magical intent. But maybe, just for luck, double-check that your comb isn't buzzing during the next thunderstorm. Because honestly, some superstitions are worth keeping, just in case. If you think modern parenting is stressful with its car seats, organic snacks, and the existential dread of screen time, try raising a baby in medieval Europe, where the greatest threat to your child wasn't colic, but an impatient demon lurking by the cradle. Welcome to the world of baptismal panic, where newborns weren't really considered people until they'd been dunked, splashed, or otherwise protected from supernatural abduction first. Let's establish the medieval rules of engagement. Birth was not a moment for celebration. It was a spiritual emergency. The second a child emerged into the world, the clock started ticking. Every moment unbaptized was an opportunity for disaster. If a baby died before baptism, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a cosmic blunder. The soul would be left in limbo, or worse, snatched by devils, fairies, or any other invisible freeloaders the local clergy could dream up in practice. This meant baptisms were performed with a sense of urgency that would shame a modern fire drill. Forget waiting for Sunday service. Midwives, priests, even nervous grandmothers were authorized to do the job if things looked dicey. There are recorded cases of babies being baptized with river water, pond water, and on particularly desperate occasions, beer. And you thought your family traditions were weird. The sound of church bells became the medieval version of a neighborhood group chat, ringing frantically at the birth of a child, tolling again after a baptism, or chiming ominously if something went wrong. The peal of bells wasn't just for celebration. It was believed to scare away evil spirits hovering, ready to claim a fresh soul. Sometimes, If a child was sickly, the bells would ring longer and louder, a not so subtle hint to the supernatural that the villagers were paying attention. Let's take a little detour to the crossroads, the preferred burial site for unbaptized infants. It was believed that these souls were trapped in limbo, unable to enter heaven, but also too innocent for hell. So, they were interred at the intersections of roads, literally on the margins of society, to confuse their restless spirits and, just maybe, to keep them from coming home. Next time you pass an old, lonely crossroads in Europe, you might be treading over centuries of grief and superstition. Imagine the pressure on parents. Your baby is wailing, the midwife is sweating, and the priest is stuck in traffic, or, more likely, a rainstorm, with his horse refusing to cross a suspiciously muddy field. What do you do? There's the famous story of Martha of Saxony, whose baby arrived prematurely during a blizzard. The local bell tower collapsed under the weight of snow. Desperate, Martha baptized her newborn in a freezing river, using her own shawl as a makeshift altar cloth. When the priest finally showed up, all he could do was nod and ring a handbell for good measure. Breath in that anxiety, the sense that a single misstep, a moment's delay, could doom a soul forever, not just to social shame, but to spiritual peril. Medieval Christianity didn't mess around. Original sin was an inherited problem, and babies weren't given the benefit of the doubt. Of course, superstition went hand in hand with religious ritual. Families would pin protective amulets to a baby's swaddling, tiny crosses, bits of iron, or even bits of bread, because you never know when carbs might save you. Mothers whispered prayers over their child's first bath, careful not to spill a drop lest the water carry away the baby's soul. And if the baby sneezed before baptism, the room would erupt in a flurry of God bless yous, each one a tiny force field. There were even rules about who could be a godparent. Choose unwisely, and you risked inviting a curse on your child. Godparents who failed to show up promptly might be blamed for every fever, rash, or colicky night for years. The stakes were high, and the paperwork, mostly oral tradition, but still was strict. Yet beneath all the ritual and panic, there's a deep, aching love. The frantic bell ringing, the river baptisms, the protective bread necklaces. These weren't just empty gestures. They were acts of desperate care, small defenses against an unpredictable world. In a time when half of all children died before their 5th birthday, the need to believe in some kind of spiritual safety net was overwhelming. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. Modern parenting is full of anxieties, but rarely do we fear for our children's souls with the same bone-deep terror. The medieval world was harsh, but it was also fiercely protective. Every ritual, every bell was a promise. We will do whatever it takes to keep you safe in this life and the next dot. So, the next time you hear church bells ringing in the distance, remember, you're listening to the echoes of centuries of parental hope and fear. And maybe, just maybe, a little reassurance that even in the darkest times, someone was fighting for you. Bells, bread, river water, and all. If you've ever woken up to a frog in your bedroom, you probably thought, that's weird. In medieval Europe, you'd have thought, oh no, I'm definitely cursed. Amphibians, those warty, blinking bundles of confusion, were for centuries the scapegoats of European superstition, occupying a place somewhere between kitchen pest and magical assassin. Let's start with the toad. The poor toad, in a world obsessed with signs and omens. The sudden appearance of a toad in your pantry was not just an inconvenience. It was a cosmic red flag. Toads, after all, were believed to be witches' favorite animal companions, their familiars. Why? Because toads looked untrustworthy. They were lumpy. They sweated poison. Their eyes had a smug, knowing quality that suggested they were eavesdropping for the devil. If a toad wandered into your kitchen, the medieval solution wasn't just to shoo it outside. No, you had to salt your doorstep, sweep your house while reciting psalms backward, and maybe burn a sprig of rosemary for good measure. That, or start interrogating your neighbors about recent curses, because clearly someone was out to get your bread. But toads weren't just bearers of bad luck. They were also believed to be sources of magical power. Toadstones, small, mysterious objects supposedly found inside the heads of living toads, were thought to counteract poison. A lucky villager who discovered such a stone might set it in a ring and wear it as a talisman. In reality, most toadstones were fossilized fish teeth or pebbles. But try telling that to someone who'd just been bitten by a snake and needed all the luck they could muster. Frogs didn't fare much better. Frogs croaking at night, a sign of impending death. Frogs in the well. Tainted water, obviously, but also a sure sign of a hex. In many villages, it was considered extremely unlucky to find a frog beneath your bed. Superstition held that a witch could send a frog to steal your dreams, drain your vitality, or cause illness with just a stare. Pause for a moment. Imagine lying in your drafty medieval bedroom, sheets scratchy, air thick with the scent of old straw and smoke, and suddenly ribbit. You sit up, your heart pounds. Was it just a frog, or is there a curse in motion somewhere in the shadows? There's a tragicomic story from the court of Louis XI of France. A noblewoman, already reeling from gossip about her supposed love potions, suffered a miscarriage and found a frog hiding in her linen chest soon after. She blamed the animal for her loss, convinced it was sent by a jealous rival. The court responded not with empathy, but with suspicion and a witch trial. The frog, presumably, hopped away without comment. Even medicine, that bastion of scientific rigor, by which I mean herbal guesswork and frantic prayers, found a use for amphibians. Plague doctors sometimes prescribed frog broth or dried toad powder as cures. This wasn't exactly endorsed by any medical board, but desperate times call for desperate toads. And if the patient died, well, clearly the toad wasn't magical enough, or perhaps the wrong kind of amphibian had been used. Quality control, medieval style, frogs and toads also wriggled their way into the fashion world. Wealthy women wore amulets shaped like frogs to ward off illness. Some carried tiny pouches containing the bones of amphibians collected during midnight expeditions and boiled to purify them of evil. These toad-based accessories were considered chic in the way that only medieval fashion could be. If it looks weird and makes you smell bad, it must be working. Rituals abounded. Some villagers believed that burying a live frog under your doorstep could protect the household from storms. Others thought boiling a toad alive and scattering its ashes would break a particularly stubborn curse. Note, do not try this at home, or anywhere, ever. All these rituals shared a single, anxious logic. If something is strange and hard to control, it must be magical. And if it's magical, it's both dangerous and useful depending on how you use it. Let's slow down here. It's easy to laugh at these beliefs, but they came from a world where real dangers, illness, famine, sudden death, felt random and unstoppable. When you have little control, you try to find meaning anywhere you can, even in the startled eyes of a frog on your pillow. Even now, traces of these amphibious superstitions survive. Good luck charms, lucky frog figurines, the faint sense that something's off when you find a toad staring at you from the garden. Maybe we don't blame frogs for our bad days anymore, but the urge to find patterns in the chaos is as human as ever. So, next time you see a frog in an unexpected place, consider the history it carries, centuries of fear, wonder, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, a little magic still hops among us. It starts innocently enough. You tell your neighbor, your baby is adorable. The room freezes. Eyes widen. Suddenly, an older relative rushes in, furiously gesturing with garlic and muttering a prayer, while your complimented neighbor starts spitting on the floor for luck. Welcome to the world of the evil eye, where admiration is a weapon and being too nice is, frankly, suspicious. The evil eye is one of the most persistent and awkward superstitions to ever plague Europe's social life. And let's be honest, medieval social life was already a minefield. The core belief is deceptively simple. Too much attention, especially admiration, is dangerous. Your praise could jinx the recipient, drawing down envy, bad luck, or even physical harm. In short, the complimenter becomes an accidental curslinger, leaving chaos in their well-meaning wake. Why? Because envy, in the medieval imagination, wasn't just an ugly emotion. It was a tangible, contagious force. If you admired someone's health, wealth, or disturbingly perfect cabbage, your gaze could send a hex their way. Children, animals, prized livestock, all vulnerable to this wandering eye. If something went wrong after a compliment, the evil eye was to blame. Protective measures abounded, most of them more awkward than effective. In Italy, a new mother might fasten a small red ribbon or coral charm to her baby's swaddling, a visual back-off to jealous glances. In Greece and the Balkans, mothers would mutter terses, spit, reel, or pretend in the direction of the compliment, or, if things got truly dire, pretend to insult their own children to offset your praise. Oh, he's not that handsome. He's scrawny and cries too much. You know, just in case the evil eye is eavesdropping. Jewelry became protective armor. In Turkey and the Mediterranean, blue glass beads, called nazar charms, were popular. Shiny amulets designed to deflect the evil stare. In parts of Eastern Europe, you might see babies swaddled with strings of garlic or wolf's teeth, or sporting little pins shaped like hands, the hamza, fingers splayed to fend off curses. Forget fashion sense. If it looked weird and repelled envy, it was in. Of course, some measures were less chic. In rural England, folks believed urinating in the corners of your house could block the evil eye's influence. The logic, apparently, bad luck was afraid of strong-smelling pee. Honestly, if your biggest concern is a supernatural curse, maybe just close the windows and invest in a chamber pot. The rituals grew even stranger when livestock were involved. If a cow gave sour milk or a horse went lame, the farmer would inspect the animal for hidden hex marks, then wave burning herbs or pass the creature through smoke. In especially suspicious villages, it wasn't uncommon for everyone to avoid direct eye contact, lest someone's side eye start a chain reaction of misfortune. Social anxiety, weaponized by tradition. One infamous story comes from a 17th century Polish village, where a baker's wife complimented a neighbor's butter churn. The next day, the churn broke, the butter spoiled, and the cow responsible for the milk developed a suspicious limp. The neighbor didn't blame coincidence, shoddy woodworking, or the cow's advanced age. No, she blamed the compliment. The solution: The baker's wife had to walk backward around the churn 3 times, spitting salt and reciting a prayer. The cow, for good measure, got an extra garland of garlic. Pause and imagine living in a world so paranoid that basic politeness required ritual footnotes. Compliment your friend, then immediately touch wood, spit, or mutter a curse. It's a wonder anyone ever spoke at all, but beneath the absurdity was a real human anxiety, fear of envy, and the suspicion that misfortune was never truly random. Compliments, in this view, were dumb. They built social bonds but also introduced danger, forcing people to constantly weigh their words. The evil eye turned admiration into a kind of social landmine, and politeness into an obstacle course. Let's not pretend the evil eye vanished with powdered wigs and the Enlightenment. The superstition is still alive in charms, in ritual, spit, and in the nervous way people sometimes deflect praise. Don't jinx it, we say, half joking, but not really. It's a trace of the old belief that too much luck is suspicious, too much happiness invites correction from fate, that to be seen is to be at risk. So next time you pay a compliment and someone immediately knocks on wood, tosses salt, or gives you a look that says you've done enough, remember, you're treading on centuries of awkward, anxious tradition. Maybe throw in a fake insult or a little spit for good measure. After all, you never know who or what is listening. Every culture has its social landmines, but medieval Europe turned weddings and funerals into elaborate obstacle courses where one wrong move could doom you, your spouse, or your entire afterlife. Forget bridezillas and awkward toasts here. The stakes were curses, bad harvests, or ghosts with long grudges. Call it ceremonial anxiety with a supernatural twist. Let's start with weddings, those supposedly joyous occasions. In medieval times, getting married wasn't just about love, property, or cementing alliances between feuding goat herders. It was about not screwing up the ritual, lest you invoke the wrath of fate. The wrong color dress, bad luck. The wrong day, disastrous. And if the bride so much as stumbled walking to the altar, whispers would ripple through the crowd. She'll bring sorrow to the house. Sometimes it was enough to make elopement look downright sensible. Why all the paranoia? Well, people believed the boundary between life stages, single to married, alive to dead, was thin, and spirits loved to lurk at these transitions. At weddings, it was traditional for brides to cry during the ceremony, to wash away misfortune, no tears. People would mutter that she was inviting envy or was already under a spell. In some regions, the bride wore veils, not for modesty, but as a magical barrier against wandering ghosts, and, let's be honest, judgmental ants. Throwing rice or wheat at the couple was more than just messy fun. It was a fertility charm, meant to confuse evil spirits and ensure the couple's first child would arrive on schedule. Rings, too, weren't just about love or status. Circles were thought to ward off the supernatural. Lose your ring during the ceremony. Congratulations, you've just scheduled your first marital crisis. Let's not forget the food. Serving fish was risky. In some regions, too slippery, could symbolize unfaithfulness. Bread was safest, but had to be baked without a single curse. Uttered in the kitchen, good luck with that. And God help you if the wine spilled. Spilling wine was seen as a sign that blood would soon be spilled in the household. Suddenly, the open bar doesn't sound so festive. Funerals, meanwhile, were an entire genre of superstition. The transition from life to death was even more fraught with rules and rituals than the transition from single to married. A body had to be carried out feet first, lest the soul look back and decide to haunt the house. Mirrors were covered, as we saw in chapter 6, to keep the soul from getting trapped. Clocks were stopped, doors opened wide, all invitations to ease the passage of the departed and prevent restless wandering. The funeral procession was a show of status. Yes, but also a careful parade of magical thinking. If the pallbearer stumbled or the coffin bumped into the doorway, it was considered a sign that someone else in the house would soon follow. Mourners sometimes wore masks or veils, not just to hide grief, but to confuse spirits looking to hitch a ride back among the living. And then there were the deathly faux pas. Don't cross the path of a funeral procession. You risked being the next to die. Don't let the church bell toll an odd number of times. Odd numbers tempted fate. Don't touch the corpse unless you wanted the deceased's ailments transferred to you. And whatever you do, don't sneeze during the eulogy. That was seen as an omen of more death to come, or, at the very least, an invitation for someone to start panicking and throw salt at you. One particularly awkward moment is recorded in the parish records of Wiltshire, England. A priest, suffering from hay fever, sneezed 3 times during a wedding ceremony. Guests froze. The bride wept, not with joy but terror, convinced her union was doomed. The groom tried to laugh it off, but the bride's mother had already started dousing the couple in holy water just to be safe. By the next morning, half the village was gossiping about what disaster would strike first: a failed harvest, a sickly child, or maybe just an unusually persistent head cold. But perhaps the most telling superstition was the idea that improper mourning could anger the dead. If a widow remarried too quickly, or if a family didn't cry enough, it was believed that the deceased would return, rattling windows, causing nightmares, or making livestock mysteriously barren. In some towns, professional mourners were hired to weep loudly and convincingly, ensuring the dead felt sufficiently honored and the living could move on without spiritual backlash. Pause here. Imagine living in a world so dense with invisible rules, where every gesture, every bite, every tear might determine the fate of your soul. The anxiety is almost comforting in its familiarity. Aren't we all just trying to get through life's milestones without accidentally cursing ourselves? Today, we keep traces of these superstitions. We wear black to funerals, toss rice at weddings, avoid certain days for big events, and say bless you at awkward times. We're not as far from our anxious ancestors as we think, so the next time you attend a ceremony and feel nervous about doing something wrong, remember, you're not alone. Generations before you were equally terrified, and maybe, just maybe, their fear kept them just a little safer from the unknown. Some people avoid stepping on cracks. Medieval Europeans avoided certain numbers with the same sweaty-palmed terror, usually reserved for pestilence and relatives dropping by unannounced. Counting, for them, was less about mathematics and more about dodging misfortune, because numbers, those innocent-looking glyphs, could be portals for disaster if pronounced or used carelessly. Let's begin with the infamous 13. Even now, it's the bad boy of numerals, skipped in elevators, missing from table settings, forever linked to Friday and its legendary bad luck. But in medieval Europe, the dread was even sharper. 13 was a number that dared you to tempt fate. After all, the Last Supper featured 13 guests, and we all know how well that turned out, for everyone, except, of course, the wine industry. Towns would avoid numbering houses 13, and you'd never catch a baker selling a batch of 13 loaves. In some regions, Wedding feasts capped the guest list at 12, leaving a 13th chair empty for luck. If someone showed up unexpectedly, people would scramble to reseat the table, lest they accidentally summon a year of crop failures, or at the very least, give Aunt Mildred something else to complain about. But 13 didn't hog all the paranoia. The number 4 quatuor in Latin was also treated with suspicion, especially by the mathematically inclined monks who spent their lives illuminating manuscripts and, apparently, sweating over arithmetic. 4, you see, was associated with death in several cultures. In certain abbeys, monks would skip the 4th psalm or assign it to be recited silently, as if the very sound of 4 could attract trouble. Because why take chances when spiritual physics is on the line? Even measurements weren't safe. In some villages, counting aloud was done with bizarre caution. Shepherds invented their own counting systems, using old Celtic or Norse words, lest the sheep overhear the real numbers and drop dead out of spite. Jan, Dan, Titira, Mitira went one such system. On the surface, it sounds like a child's rhyme. But really, it's a linguistic firewall against supernatural livestock sabotage. The number 7, on the other hand, was worshipped with the kind of giddy devotion usually reserved for relics or seasonal ale. 7 was lucky, magical, divine. Unless, of course, it wasn't. 7 years bad luck for breaking a mirror. 7 generations cursed for a specific offense. And, in the oddest twist, 7 sneezes in a row meant you'd die before sunset. For the particularly allergic, this turned hay fever into a spectator sport. Let's introduce a real medieval anecdote. In 1472, a woman named Hildegard, pregnant for what felt like forever, flatly refused to give birth on the 13th of the month. She insisted on waiting, pacing her cottage with the determined energy of someone bargaining with fate. The village midwife begged her to reconsider, but Hildegard stood firm. Day turned to night, labor stalled, and, inevitably, complications arose. By the time she allowed the process, it was too late. The villagers shook their heads, not at fate, but at Hildegard's stubborn numerology. Sometimes, fear isn't just harmless. It's fatal. You might be tempted to roll your eyes at all this, but let's slow down for a second. Isn't there something oddly comforting about finding meaning in numbers, even if it's absurd? In a world full of uncertainty, illness, war, crop, blight, attaching hope or dread to certain digits made the chaos a little more manageable. If you could avoid disaster by skipping 4 or leaving an empty seat, why not? It was insurance, paid not in coin, but in ritual. This numerical anxiety wasn't limited to households. Merchants avoided unlucky prices. Architects sometimes refused to build steps or windows in multiples of 13. Even graveyards had their arithmetic. No 13th grave in a row, no 4th tombstone on the left. If someone died on the 13th, priests hurried through extra prayers. Just to be sure, numbers shaped the landscape as much as any wall or roof. Curiously, certain numbers were only considered unlucky depending on context. 3 was both sacred trinity, anyone, and suspicious the 3rd time's the charm or the curse. 5 might be fine for counting coins, but 5 people at a table, risky business. 6, with its obvious number of the beast potential, got side-eyed by everyone from theologians to DAIRYMAIDS. Fast forward to today, and we still feel the ripple effects. Hotels skip the 13th floor, athletes refuse to wear certain jersey numbers, and lottery players avoid digits with a history. In elevators, in games, even in birthday parties, we treat numbers like loaded dice. Maybe the superstitions have faded, but the urge remains. To count, to control, to bargain with fate by shuffling the symbols. So next time you find yourself hesitating before saying a number aloud, or nervously counting something twice, just in case, remember, you're not alone. You're surrounded by centuries of anxious arithmetic, whispered from abbey to farmhouse, from graveyard to kitchen table. And honestly, isn't it reassuring to know that, when in doubt, you can always blame the math? Let's get one thing straight. Medieval Europe was not a restful place. Between plague, famine, and the constant threat of being denounced as a heretic for the way you pronounced parsley, you'd think sleep would be a welcome escape. Unfortunately, for most people, the night was when things got really scary. Not just because of bandits or bats in the rafters, but because the very act of falling asleep was fraught with spiritual peril. Picture it, the sun goes down, the fire dies to embers, and your drafty cottage fills with shadows. You slip beneath a blanket if you're lucky, and the weight of a hard day's labor finally starts to slip away. But as you drift off, there's a fear nibbling at the edge of your dreams, because everyone knows that nighttime is the witching hour, and sleep is when your defenses are down. The greatest terror, nightmares, weren't just bad dreams, they were assaults. Nightmare comes from the Old English mare, a demonic entity that sat on your chest while you slept, suffocating you with fear, paralysis, or sometimes actual death. In some villages, it was said the mare would ride the sleeper, stealing their breath or even their soul. If you woke in the middle of the night, unable to move, feeling a crushing weight on your chest, you weren't just having sleep paralysis. You were being visited by something evil. This wasn't just peasant folklore. Learned men wrote treatises on night hags, sleep demons, and evil spirits that preyed on the unguarded mind. Entire households developed elaborate rituals to protect themselves. Beds were pushed away from windows, iron scissors were placed under pillows, and salt was scattered in circles around sleeping children. Because obviously, what demon could resist the power of table condiments? In Norway and Sweden, it was said that witches could send their souls out at night, traveling like a phantom mist to torment the innocent. In Germany, tales of the Alp, a goblin that pressed down on your chest, spread through winter villages. Every culture had its own version, but the pattern was the same. Sleep wasn't safe. Every night was an audition for a new horror story. The unlucky few who suffered repeated attacks sometimes became outcasts, or were labeled as cursed, bewitched, or, worst of all, paying the price for secret sins. A man from Saxony, recorded in the late 1400s, slept every night inside a circle of salt and bread, convinced this would protect him. His family, too scared to join him, slept elsewhere. Each morning, he checked for smudges in his circle, convinced that even the faintest disturbance meant something had tried, and maybe failed, to break through. And if you did die in your sleep, that was often explained as a nightmare's work, a final, fatal visit from the mare or hag. Families would find creative ways to prevent this, sewing tiny silver crosses into nightshirts, hanging garlic from bedposts, even placing open Bibles under pillows which, let's face it, would keep most people up all night out of sheer discomfort. Breathing room, imagine the exhaustion, the endless anxiety. Daytime was a grind, but nighttime was a test of faith and ingenuity. How many rituals does it take to feel safe enough to close your eyes? In some places, People developed elaborate bedtime prayers, recited in exact order, to fend off nightly threats. Mess up the words. Well, sleep tight. Children, of course, got the worst of it. Babies were swaddled with amulets, and mothers would sing lullabies that doubled as magical incantations. Sleep, my darling, and may no night hag find you. That's not just soothing, it's strategic. Even architecture reflected these fears. In some houses, bedrooms were built away from main doors, or without direct lines to windows, all to prevent spirits from sneaking in while everyone slept. Doorways were sometimes marked with chalk sigils or protective herbs. The bedroom became a fortress, not against burglars, but against nightmares with names. And yet, in a strange way, these rituals brought people together, families, gathered by candlelight, whispering prayers and sharing stories of close calls with the supernatural. There's comfort in collective anxiety, in believing that your neighbor is just as scared as you are. Maybe that's why these traditions lasted, because they made the dark a little less lonely. Today, we know sleep paralysis is a medical phenomenon, not a demon's visit, but old habits die hard. Many still hang dream catchers, place protective objects on nightstands, or recite a favorite phrase before bed. Maybe we still crave a sense of control over what happens in the dark. So, as you settle into bed tonight, think of your medieval ancestors, fighting sleep with salt circles and whispered prayers. And remember, if you wake up and can't move, just breathe. You're not cursed, you're just human. Or at least, that's what we tell ourselves. Let's be honest, you probably consider yourself rational, maybe even a little skeptical. You don't worry about witches in your bread or night hags squatting on your chest. And yet, when you spill salt, some ancient muscle memory twitches and, without thinking, you toss a pinch over your left shoulder. Congratulations, you're living proof that superstition never really left us. It just got sneakier. Superstitions have a way of shape-shifting, surviving the centuries like stubborn weeds poking through the cracks of modern life. Most people don't know why they say, "Bless you," after a sneeze, or avoid walking under ladders, or tap wood for luck. But each act is an echo, a distant cousin to medieval anxieties that once ruled the world with an iron fist and a trembling hand. Let's take the classic, knocking on wood. Once upon a time, trees were believed to be inhabited by spirits or minor gods. If you wanted to avoid tempting fate, you'd knock on a trunk, hoping the woodland residents would grant you luck, or at least keep their curses to themselves. Today, the practice persists, though nobody's worried about offending the oak in their dining room. Still, when someone says, "That'll never happen to me," knock on wood, the urge is nearly irresistible. Would you risk it? The same goes. 4 ladders. In medieval Europe, a ladder leaning against a wall created a triangle, a sacred shape, symbolizing the Holy Trinity. To walk through that triangle was to break divine order, inviting disaster. It didn't help that executioners used ladders to string up the condemned. Bad luck? Maybe just bad association. Either way, centuries later, we still swerve around ladders like there's a trapdoor to hell beneath. Then there's the classic, "Bless you." As explored in Chapter 1, this reflex dates back to when sneezes were spiritual emergencies. Invitations for your soul to make a break for it. Today, it's just politeness. Or is it? If you don't say "bless you," someone always notices, and for a split second, you feel like you've committed a tiny social sin. That's how rituals persist, as manners, habits, little ticks of anxiety disguised as etiquette. Black cats, too, haven't escaped the long shadow of medieval paranoia. Even now, some people cross the street to avoid a black cat's path. Shelter. Adoption rates for black cats are lower than other colors. On Halloween, they're seen as omens, not just pets. The superstition doesn't need to make sense. It only needs to linger. What about Friday the 13th? Or the idea that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck? Both trace their roots to medieval Europe, where numbers, as we saw, carried weighty symbolism and mirrors were portals to the unknown. Today, hotels skip the 13th floor, and people dread that extra sliver of glass on the bathroom floor. Are we rational, or are we just really creative at pretending not to believe? Let's not forget lucky pennies, horseshoes over doorways, crossing fingers, or avoiding the phrase, "speak of the devil." Each of these is an inherited ritual, a little insurance policy against chaos. They're harmless, usually, but they show how the human brain, even when wrapped in Wi-Fi and reason, still yearns for patterns, protection, and a sense of control. Sometimes, modern superstitions get new outfits. Athletes develop bizarre game day rituals, lucky socks, forbidden phrases, routines that must never change. Office workers touch their favorite mug before a meeting. Couples have their song, which must play for good luck before big moments. None of these would seem out of place in a medieval village, just with less mud and more wi-fi. Pause for a breath. Let that settle. There's a reason these rituals survive. They give us comfort. When the world feels random, when the job market tanks, or your phone dies for no reason, or the subway stalls between stations, it's natural to look for signs, patterns, or little actions that might tip the scales in your favor. Superstition, at its core, is about hope. Hope that we can influence the outcome, that the universe is listening, that luck can be courted with a knock, a toss of salt, a whispered phrase. And maybe, deep down, we keep these superstitions because they connect us to everyone who came before. Each ritual is a handshake across the centuries, from the anxious baker to the nervous parent to you, glancing at the calendar and feeling a jolt on Friday the 13th. So, the next time you catch yourself obeying a ritual you can't explain, don't feel silly, feel human. Superstition isn't a glitch in our programming. It's part of our story. A story that's always searching for meaning, and always just a little bit afraid of what's waiting in the dark. History books love to talk in broad strokes, kingdoms, pandemics, superstitions believed by the people. But superstition, at its most powerful, is always personal. It isn't some fog that descends upon the land. It's a fear living in your neighbor's chest, or a hope clutched in a trembling hand. So, tonight, let's meet 3 very real Europeans who lived, loved, and sometimes died because of the beliefs swirling in their worlds. First, say hello to Margaret van der Velde, a Flemish widow from the bustling port city of Bruges around the year 1548. Margaret's daily routine wasn't just washing linens or buying eels at the market. It was donning her string of garlic every morning without fail. Not because she was trying to fend off suitors, though that was an added bonus, but because she believed, with her whole heart, that garlic warded off evil spirits. Her late husband had died suddenly, and ever since, Margaret felt shadowed by a presence, a shiver at her back, footsteps at night, a chill whenever she crossed the threshold. The garlic necklace was her invisible shield, a quiet protest against helplessness in a world she couldn't control. The neighbors whispered, of course, but Margaret outlived most of them. Sometimes, superstition is just self-care, dressed in clothes. Travel now to a rainy village in southern France, 1623, where we find Luc Morel, a boy of 11, with a mop of dark hair and a knack for finding trouble. Luc was playing by the river when a sudden lightning bolt struck a willow tree nearby. The next morning, someone found strange marks burned into the earth, and Luc, dazed and frightened, confessed to seeing a woman of light in the flash. Word spread, suspicion blossomed, and before long, Luc was dragged before the town elders and accused of witchcraft. Why? Because lightning didn't strike at random, they insisted. It chose. The fear in the village was almost tangible, a living thing moving from house to house. Luc was spared barely after his mother convinced the priest to perform a week of exorcisms. The willow never grew back. Luc, however, survived, carrying the scar of fear and the silent promise to never speak of lightning again. Lastly, let's enter the echoing halls of a Bavarian monastery, winter of 1502, where Brother Johannes was famous for two things: his skill at brewing beer and his secret dread of reflections. Johannes believed that mirrors and still water could catch the soul. Every morning he hurried past the icy wash basin, avoiding his own gaze. One December night, after a bout of insomnia and one too many sips of his own brew, Johannes saw, or thought he saw, his reflection move independently in the monastery window. The terror never quite left him. For weeks he covered every reflective surface with linen. His brethren joked, but Johannes was not convinced. To him, superstition was as real as the cold stone beneath his feet, a silent threat lurking just out of sight. When he died, the brothers found a tiny mirror wrapped in black cloth hidden beneath his bed. Pause for a moment. These aren't stories of distant, faceless peasants. These are individuals. Marguerite with her garlic, Luc with his fear of storms, Johannes with his shrouded mirror, each responding to the chaos around them in the only way they knew. Their lives remind us that superstitions weren't just community folklore, but intensely private acts of courage or desperation. Sometimes, a ritual is a way to grieve. Sometimes, it's a shield against being powerless. Often, it's the only comfort a person has when logic and medicine and prayer all fail. And while centuries have passed, our personal superstitions still bubble up when life gets unpredictable. Maybe it's your grandmother refusing to sleep, with her feet facing the door. Maybe it's you, muttering a half-remembered blessing before an exam. The people behind the panic are not so different from us. In every age, fear and hope shape our daily lives. Marguerite's garlic, Lutz's silence, Johannes's covered mirror. These were their survival strategies. Small, persistent rebellions against the unknown. They weren't fools. They were just profoundly human. So the next time you reach for your own lucky charm, remember, you're not alone. You're following a thread that runs through every anxious heartbeat in history, each one hoping desperately to make it through the night. Let's dim the torchlight for a moment and step back. Strip away the cackling witches, the ominous bells, and the garlic necklaces, and what are we really left with? Something so human it aches. Belief, fear, and the desperate longing to find meaning in a world that never really makes sense. That's the core of superstition, not the wild stories, not the rituals or the odd collections of shoes and teeth, but a trembling thread that runs through every human heart. From the moment our ancestors first wondered why thunder crashed or crops failed, they spun stories to patch the holes in their understanding. Maybe it was a demon in the wind. Maybe the river needed appeasing. Maybe, just maybe, a pinch of salt could keep your child safe at night. In a universe that could turn hostile at any moment, belief became a kind of shelter, a flickering candle held up against the dark dot. It's easy, from our perch on the far side of history, to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Bread demons, cursed combs, bells ringing away invisible spirits. Surely, we say, we're smarter now. And yet, superstition persists, sometimes dressed as tradition, sometimes masquerading as just in case. The world remains unpredictable, and the heart, if anything, remains just as hungry for comfort. Fear is the engine, belief is the map, and sometimes the two are so entangled it's impossible to know which came first. Medieval Europe was a time of hardship. Plagues, wars, hunger, and grief shadowed every life. Superstition was not just a quirk, it was a survival strategy. It gave shape to anxiety, turned helplessness into action, and let communities bond. Overshared rituals, even when they didn't fully understand the rules. But superstition wasn't only about panic. At its best, it brought people together. Shared beliefs, even the odd ones, knitted families and villages closer. Lighting a candle, ringing a bell, or hiding a shoe became an act of solidarity, a whispered promise, you're not alone. In a world where so much was out of your control, these rituals offered a thread of connection, stretching from your own hands to every ancestor who ever whispered a prayer in the dark. There's a gentle irony here. For all our progress, we're still telling stories to soothe ourselves. Science may have replaced the demon in the wind with atmospheric pressure, but it hasn't banished our need for ritual, or our urge to ward off the unknown with a lucky token, a knock on wood, or a secret wish. That's not stupidity. That's being human. Pause, breathe, and let that settle. Because beneath every superstition, however odd, however awkward, is a question. How do I keep the people I love safe? How do I face the uncertainty that comes with being alive? These aren't relics of the past. They're the drumbeat of every human heart, across every age. Sometimes superstition fails. The bread still goes bad. The baby still gets sick. The bell doesn't ring in time. And in those moments, belief shifts. It bends, it evolves, or it becomes something new. We make up fresh rituals, find new patterns, cling to whatever gives us a sense of agency. In this way, superstition is never static. It's the story we keep rewriting, every generation, as the darkness shifts and the questions change. So, if you ever feel foolish for your little rituals, for tossing salt, for whispering bless you, for sidestepping the ladder at work, remember, you're not alone, and you never have been. You're part of a lineage of anxious, hopeful, brilliantly creative humans who did their best to bring order to the chaos, one awkward superstition at a time. In the end, maybe the real magic isn't in the rituals, but in our shared vulnerability. The fact that, in the face of the unknown, we reach for each other, for comfort, for explanation, for the simple reassurance that we're in this together, and that's the most powerful superstition of all. If you made it through plagues, cats, bread, demons, and night hags, congratulations, you're officially cursed with curiosity. So hit that subscribe, leave a comment about your weirdest family superstition, and remember, nothing in history is truly boring when you look close enough, especially in the dark.